Hello viewers. Today we study The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, a short story by Washington Irving. In this unit, we will first of all introduce the author and the background to the story. We will identify the genres to which the short story belongs, and we will itemize their characteristics. And finally, we will study the characters and themes of the story. But before we begin, let us first summarize the short story itself. Washington Irving's Legend of Sleepy Hollow tells the story of Ichabod Crane, a school teacher in a small village, and his adventures during his life there. Set in the early 19th century, the story follows Ichabod as he works in his village schoolroom and dreams of the day when he will be rich. Ichabod's obsession with the supernatural is highlighted as he reads and listens to tales about witches and headless horsemen and so on. Desiring to marry the prettiest and richest village beauty, Ichabod deludes himself that he will soon be rich, only to find that she turns down his proposal. Worse still, on his way home, he meets a headless horseman and disappears. First of all, let us gain an introduction to the work of Washington Irving. Published in 1919-20, the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, Gent, by Washington Irving, included two short stories that are today accounted among the best American short stories ever, Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. The sketchbook was first published when Irving was living and traveling in England and Europe. Writing under the pseudonym of Geoffrey Canyon, the stories were recounted in the text by Diedrich Knickerbocker, who himself claimed to have heard these stories from inhabitants of the state of New York. Irving was among the earliest American authors, alongside James Fenimore Cooper, to achieve fame in both Europe and America, and he encouraged later American authors such as Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and H.W. Longfellow. He was also admired by English authors such as Coleridge and Dickens. Irving's contribution to the literary world is also seen in his arguing for stronger copyright laws, which would guard authors from piracy and infringement of their rights as authors. He is amongst the foremost authors of the American Romantic period. Both Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, on which Irving's fame rests today, though he was a prolific author in his time, are stories that read like folklore. There is also a strong element of literary parody that runs through them, in addition to a gentle mocking of the rural populace of New York State, their customs, beliefs, and superstitions. He can also be seen as an author who, like Thomas Hardy in English literature, made a geographical area and its people his own particular domain. In his case, rural New York and the small communities along the banks of the River Hudson and in the Catskill Mountains. Now we'll look at the plot and setting of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. The short story begins with a description of the small village of Sleepy Hollow, its bucolic but beautiful surroundings, and the superstitious nature of its inhabitants. The protagonist, Ichabod Crane, is introduced to us as the village schoolmaster and choirmaster, a Yankee who boards with the people of the village, currying favor with the wives and daughters, but largely ignored by the menfolk. His greed and gullibility, in addition to his credulous belief in ghosts and witchcraft, are pointed out to the reader early on. Ichabod Crane discovers the charms of Katrina Von Tassel, the daughter of a rich farmer, and pursues her, hoping to marry her. Her chief admirer is Brom Bones, a young, mischievous charmer, given to playing pranks, but at heart a good guy. After a party at Katrina Von Tassel's home, riding home despondently because Katrina seems to have rejected his suit, Ichabod meets the chief spectre of the Valley of Sleepy Hollow, the Headless Horseman, and Ichabod disappears, some say spirited away by the Headless Horseman, though a pumpkin is found smashed at the point from which Ichabod disappeared. Soon after, Brom Bones and Katrina get married, and life goes on in Sleepy Hollow, as sleepily as ever. Sleepy Hollow in the Hudson Valley is shown by Irving to be a very sleepy little place where everyone believes in visions, hauntings, apparitions, in ghosts and the supernatural. In addition, it is a place where nature's plenty is available. The farming community is prosperous and placid, content with their abundance and set in their reposeful ways. They are a people who have an abundance of produce and they lack for nothing. And this lack makes them extremely content in the lives that they have. They have no interest in going out or in ambitions of any other kind. They are content to stay on in their own little village, happy to do what they have always done. We will now look at genres in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. It is difficult to categorize The Legend of Sleepy Hollow into any one genre, as it partakes of the characteristics of multiple genres. It starts by putting in place an atmosphere that immediately connects it to tales of ghostly horror and the Gothic. Haunted spots and twilight superstitions are introduced to the reader in the initial stages, and they persist throughout the tale. In fact, the first 1.5 pages of the story are devoted to descriptions of the many superstitions and ghosts and stories that the people of the area believe in. In Gothic vein, we are also given a multitude of details about the setting of the tale. The countryside is presented to us in all its beauty and abundance, but so also are the people and their interest in superstitions and haunting. Each of these details serves to further intensify the Gothic nature of the story, as the setting becomes a notable feature by itself. Combined with the setting is the characterization of the inhabitants. They are, most of them, a simple kind of people, but also given to a strong belief in and a horrified fascination for the supernatural. They spend the evenings telling ghost stories to each other, inducing pleasurable fears among themselves. They shudder at the stories they tell, but cannot resist telling more of such stories. Ichabod Crane fits in perfectly, as his favored reading material is Cotton Mather's text about witchcraft in New England, and these are the stories that he shares with the village folk whom he meets. So the entire community then is built up of people who are telling stories to each other, and all the stories are about witches, ghosts, apparitions, and various other supernatural elements. But the Legend of Sleepy Hollow is also a romance, the romance between Brom Bones and Katrina Van Tassel, as also Ichabod Crane's hopes of a romance with Katrina Van Tassel, though it is of course open to dispute whether Ichabod's romance is with Katrina or her inheritance. However, beyond these genres and surpassing them is the fact that the story is primarily a parody and a satire. Irving parodies most of the features of the Romance and the Gothic, even as he satirizes the sleepy, placid Dutch community. He satirizes also Ichabod Crane as a greedy and acquisitive Yankee, and of course Brom Bones as the typical rough countryman who is here in the country and has little or no culture or intellectual ability, etc. Now we look at the characters in the short story. Apart from Ichabod Crane and Brom Bones, we do not gain any great degree of knowledge of any of the other characters in the text. We are, of course, introduced to Katrina Van Tassel. We are told briefly in passing about many of the women of the village. We are also told about other families within the village, but we do not meet them or spend any time with them. The only people whom we do get to know in detail are Ichabod Crane and Brom Bones. Ichabod is given to us in painstaking detail, from his appearance, through his reading taste, his hopes and his dreams, to his dancing and singing talent. Brom Bones, as Ichabod's antagonist, is depicted in slightly less detailed fashion, but we do gain a substantial understanding of him as well. But apart from these two, we see other characters only fleetingly. Indeed, the bounties of the Van Tassel farm are characterized in greater detail than are the other characters. Most of the characters in the story are stereotypes. They are caricatures, not rounded and realistic. Ichabod Crane himself is presented to us as a cartoon. From his physical appearance, he is described in the story as a scarecrow eloped from a cornfield. To his appetite, the author says he had the dilating powers of an anaconda. To his ingratiating ways with the wives, mothers, and daughters in the neighborhood. He is also mocked by the narrator for his obsessive interest in the supernatural and marvelous tales of ghosts and goblins, haunted bridges and haunted houses, and particularly of the headless horseman. He is, of course, also particularly known for his fearful returning home after dark sets in. Every time after going out to dinner with some family, when he has to return home, he returns home in a state of fear and extreme superstition because he has been listening to stories of haunted houses all through the evening. And thus, every time he returns home in a state of trembling and fear. But in addition to mocking these features in Ichabod Crane, Irving also satirizes him as being avaricious and greedy. His wish to marry Katrina Van Tassel is primarily because of the wealth of her inheritance. Though Katrina herself is very beautiful and is seen by everybody in the village as a prime candidate for marriage, Ichabod Crane himself does not see her as attractive in and of herself. He sees her instead as attractive because with her will come the entire bounty of the Van Tassel farm. And the Van Tassel farm is the richest farm in the neighborhood. Ichabod Crane sees himself as the proud possessor of the bounty of the farm. And once married to Katrina, he does not wish to work upon this farm. He plans to sell it up and go west with his family on the proceeds of the sale of the farm. This is spelled out for the readers as the narrator gives a specific picture of his plans once he has secured Katrina's hand. And this, of course, also gives us Ichabod Crane as a dreamer because he builds castles in the air, castles which are built upon nothing other than his own dreams and hopes. So he hopes to marry Katrina, and then, of course, he builds upon that hope and plans out an entire future wherein he sells her land. He, of course, first of all feasts upon the bounty, then he sells her land and moves towards the west, taking with him Katrina and all the little children that they have had. Thus, when Brom Bones cuts him out, the readers do not feel sorry for Ichabod Crane. Rather, a mercenary fortune hunter is seen as having been vanquished by the more deserving suitor. Who is the foil to Ichabod Crane? If the latter is seen as an effeminate weakling, Brom Bones is a riotous, highly masculine male who both in physique and temperament is a counter to Ichabod's puny self. His fame rests upon his doings as a young man native to the area, the leader of a gang of young men who are ready for every form of fun and merriment, who indulge in all the races and cockfights in the area, the feuds and frolics in the neighborhood. He is also shown to us as somebody who has little or no time for learning or for any of the more cultured pursuits. So he does not go in for choir singing and he has no book learning whatsoever. And yet he is the acknowledged leader of the neighborhood youth. All the young men flock to him, and once it is known that he is courting Katrina, everybody else steps down because he is the acknowledged leader of the whole group. His leadership is unquestioned, and no one dares to stand against him. And this is especially, of course, evidenced in his courting of Katrina Van Tassel. We are not told outright whether it is Brom Bones who is responsible for Ichabod's disappearance from the area, but all the clues point in that direction. Bones's love of practical jokes, his jealousy aroused by Ichabod's success with Katrina, and his tales of having encountered the headless horseman personally. These are the clues that the text gives us before the event of the headless horseman's pursuit of Ichabod Crane. After Crane's vanishing from the region, Brom Bones' knowing looks and hearty laugh every time Ichabod is mentioned bear witness to the fact that maybe he was responsible for that disappearance. Katrina Van Tassel is not a clear portrait, as she is left vaguely delineated by the author. The text gives her to us as the inheritor to her father's farm, in addition to which she is an extremely pretty coquette. She plays along and flirts with all the young men of the neighborhood, giving no particular precedence to any of them until, of course, she encounters Ichabod Crane. Then his stories of the cultured world of New York carry her away to a certain point. But her coquetry is also visible to us in the fact that she does not, even though she pretends to like him, she does not give in to his blandishments. In fact, she rejects his proposal and then, of course, accepts Brom Bones. Apart from the distinction of being her father's heir, she is alike to all the other young girls in the region. The other characters whom we get to know in some detail are a collective, the women of the region. They are seen to be industrious, good housewives, but given, of course, to superstition and an obsessive interest in ghosts and witchcraft. In many ways, they are aligned with Ichabod Crane, their credulity and their limited interest making him their counterpart. The themes in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow are first and foremost those of the supernatural and its connection with the everyday. It is the theme that emerges strongest from this short story. While the fascination that the supernatural holds for the local inhabitants of Sleepy Hollow is remarked upon in the introductory paragraphs of the story itself, it is also of overwhelming interest to Ichabod. Thus, if Ichabod is not in his schoolroom, he spends his time either reading his book of witchcraft or talking to other people in the neighborhood about these interests that he has. While the everyday practical life of the community goes on unruffled, in spite of the people's interest in ghosts and witchcraft, the same cannot be said of Ichabod. With no permanent home in the region, he is further unsettled by his reading of Cotton Mather's book, detailing episodes of witchcraft, and his conversations with the old wives of the neighborhood, etc. The use of the supernatural by those of a particular practical bent of mind is also illustrated for us by Brom Bones' adept manipulation of the gullibility of Ichabod Crane. Another theme that the story highlights is that of human greed. Ichabod's desire for food and wealth are interchangeable. And Irving underlines Ichabod's gluttony initially when he tells us that Ichabod preferred those homes where the larders were particularly well stocked. Indeed, he only ever likes to go and stay in those homes where there is abundance of food available for him. But it is when he discovers the resources of the Van Tassel farm that we see his greed in all realms. He looks at the prosperous farm and the livestock there and transforms each item into an appetizing dish. His excessive interest in food is then shown to be indicative of his general greed as well, by showing how he wishes for the Van Tassel farm, not because of any interest in farming, but because he hopes to sell it all and use the proceeds to venture to the frontier. The greed that characterizes Ichabod is what propels him to his downfall, as it causes him to nurse ambitions of marrying Katrina, thus bringing him into conflict with Brom Bones. Masculinity and its versions are also significant in the text. We are presented with two contrasting portrayals of masculinity in Ichabod Crane and Brom Bones. The latter, as seen above, is ultra-macho, while Ichabod is the almost effeminate weakling with nothing to recommend him to the patriarchal community of Sleepy Hollow. In fact, we see also within the community of Sleepy Hollow, we see the clear distinction in gendered roles between the men folk and the women. So the men folk, all of them work upon their farms, they increase the abundance and the prosperity of the community, but they have very little to communicate with each other, nor do they indulge in storytelling or sitting around firesides and talking about things. The younger age group of men in the village, on the other hand, lead a riotous lifestyle. They wander around the community and the village, playing tricks upon each other and doing very little practical work. Thus, manliness, as it is seen in the village, is either industrious and hardworking or playful, full of practical jokes, and having a good time until such time as they settle down into their hardworking roles. The women, on the other hand, have similarly extremely specific roles which they play. The older generation of women work within their homes, look after their families, especially the children, and take care of their households. They are responsible for looking after the minor livestock as well as, of course, for food and clothing within the entire community. The younger girls of the community are the flirts of the village. They all of them are interested only in catching their husband, doing a little work but not really doing anything else. In this specific and stereotypical representation of gender, the story depicts Ichabod for us in problematic ways. As a school teacher, he is shown to be cursory in his work. Unlike the menfolk of the village, he doesn't work hard, and indeed he seems to have little or no interest in educating his pupils. He puts in very little effort and is easily distracted. And his only way of working with the young people in the village is by beating them up. His interest in furthering his acquaintance with the women of the region, in their daughters, the contents of their kitchen and the stories they tell, in addition to his activities of rocking little babies and keeping small children entertained, situates him in the feminine world. So what we have then is a portrayal of Ichabod Crane which separates him from the masculine world of the men of the village and at the same time locates him amongst the women of the village in that he is able to look after the children, keep little babies rocked and entertained and put them to sleep, and also he spends his time talking like they do of the same kinds of stories, stories of the supernatural and stories of hauntings and witchcraft. Thus, Ichabod Crane, though he is seen as a man, is also seen as a problematic man. And this problematic nature of Ichabod Crane is further underlined to us by the fact that he is educated. If the rest of the village community of men is seen as having little or no time for education, Ichabod Crane is the only one in the village who is educated, and yet his education situates him amongst women. Further, as we see that in the American society of the early 1800s, when the frontier was still being advanced, masculinity was defined in terms of action and practical deeds. Education and social skills, while necessary, were not crucial. And yet, Ichabod Crane has both education as well as social skills. He, of course, runs a choir singing in the village. He has the school of the village, and yet these are not seen as essential or necessary. These are peripheral. What was necessary was the ability to farm the land and to settle the frontier. In neither of these areas does Ichabod have any particular skill. Thus, his singing and storytelling skills, as well as his education, while useful to while away an idle hour, are not really seen as central to the nation-building project of the America of the early 1800s. These again thus serve to align him with the women folk of the region. And it is interesting that apart from Brom Bones, none of the men in the story concern themselves with Ichabod Crane. He is not seen as significant enough for the men. In fact, most of the men pretend that he does not even exist. They ignore his existence. Even when he lives in their houses, they still do not have anything to say to him. This is further emphasized for us when, after his disappearance, little thought is spared for him. There are no inquiries instituted, and life remains the same. In fact, the speculation as to what happened to Ichabod Crane after his disappearance is one that does not interest the village at all. Thus, the legend of Sleepy Hollow is a tale that is funny and entertaining, but also one that raises larger questions regarding masculinity, education and its significance, superstitious beliefs, etc., in the American society of the early 1800s. The stereotypes in the story are something that ought to be studied in some detail. We are given stereotypical images of both genders, but also of education as well as of superstition. Thus, on the one side, we see that males are seen in very definite and very specific ways, which are of course also stereotypical. Older generation of the males in the community are seen as hardworking. They are contributing to the building of the community, to the making of a prosperous America. And all of these are set within also, of course, the framework of an American national community which is coming into being at the beginning of the 1800s. The younger American men are seen as being playful, rambunctious. They have a grand time playing around, horsing around as they call it, in the community, but they have very little interest in culture, civilization, and intellectual pursuits. In fact, all of their life is a life that is lived within the body. Now, this of course also coincides with the idea that America at the beginning of the 1800s, when the frontier was yet to be settled and where there were still large tracts of empty land, was a land that was one which needed an extremely masculine presence in it because the land itself had to be tamed. So these young men are seen as instrumental and necessary in taming this land. They are also seen as young men who will later on settle down. Once they have tamed the land, once they have enjoyed the playful youth that they have, they will settle down into being the industrious, hardworking men of the older generation who will also then contribute in settling this land and farming it. Thus, we have on one side the masculine society. On the other side, we have, of course, the extremely feminine version of the women who are presented to us in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. These women again are both gendered in their perspectives, but they are also gendered in the way in which their age sets them apart. So the older women are all of them devoted to building up their homes and their families. They take care of their family members, they take care of their houses, their livestock over there, and they do this in exemplary fashion. Their children are well fed and well clothed, their homes are run impeccably, their larders are always full, and they work hard from morning to night. The young women, on the other hand, are given a brief period during which they do not so much work as enjoy the benefits that are bestowed upon them by their youth and prettiness. So they are all of them coquettes. They are all of them people who cannot really be understood, as the narrator of this tale himself says. Women of the younger age group cannot be understood, and he himself claims to have no understanding whatsoever of what happens in their minds. They are all flighty, they are all flirtatious, and they are all interested in so-called culture. So when Ichabod Crane sets up a music school, they are the ones who are there first and foremost, partaking of this so-called cultural activity that he has instituted in the village, which has otherwise no cultural activity of its own. These young women are, of course, also flirtatious, as exemplified by Katrina von Tassel, who initially encourages Ichabod Crane, so much so that he begins to believe that he will be marrying her and will then, of course, be heir to the famous von Tassel farm and all the bounty that it encompasses. Later on, this young woman, specifically Katrina von Tassel, flirts, even as she flirts with Ichabod Crane, also encourages Brom Bones. And as we see in the story, that is where the problem arises, because Brom Bones, as he is consumed by jealousy, decides to get rid of Ichabod Crane once and for all. We also, of course, see the victory of the masculine over the feminine, because even as Katrina von Tassel submits to Brom Bones, Ichabod Crane, who is also seen as effeminate, almost feminine, also submits to Brom Bones. And for this, the legend of Sleepy Hollow, the legend of the headless horseman, is crucial. And there it is that the other stereotype within the tale comes in. The legend of Sleepy Hollow gives us the story of a person who keeps his head under his arm and rides around the countryside, an apparition. And Brom Bones, who with his masculine, inventive, and ever-ready imagination is able to transform this story for his own benefit. We also see in the short story an alignment of education with effeminate behavior as well as with the feminine. Ichabod Crane is always more comfortable with the women folk of the community or with the young people of the community. And in fact, the young people, the young boys of the community who have no interest in studying, actually he gets into trouble with them, he beats them up, and he finds them fun only when he is outside the schoolroom. So education itself is seen as something that does not have a premium in this early American society and community. And education is of course also seen as useless because Brom Bones, who is not very well educated, is able to defeat Ichabod Crane with all his education and send him away from this little rural community. There is also the stereotype that the rural bucolic community is far more sound than is the Yankee. From New York, Ichabod Crane comes into this little rural community and is defeated thoroughly by the rural people and sent away from there. He never again shows his face in this area. And thus what we see is that the story also panders to a lot of stereotypical ideas and images and representation of contemporary American society. So that's the end of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and I hope you have all enjoyed this class, and we'll see you in the next class.